She whispered 3 words that night, and I have never been the same since. I was standing in the hallway of our house in Maplewood, suitcase in my hand, coat already on, ready to walk out the door and never come back. I was 19 years old. My father had been buried that afternoon. The ground was still fresh, and Margaret, the woman my father had married when I was 11, was somewhere in the kitchen, quietly pretending to clean up after the guests had gone home. I told myself I didn't owe her anything. She wasn't my biological mother. We had never been close. And with my father gone, there was nothing left holding us together. No reason, no paperwork, no obligation. I had a friend's couch waiting for me 2 towns over. All I had to do was open the front door and walk through it. But then I heard something. It wasn't a crash or a cry. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of someone trying very hard not to fall apart. The kind of sound that slips out when a person thinks no one is listening. A small, broken exhale, the kind that carries years inside of it. I set my suitcase down. I don't know why. My feet just stopped moving. I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, and I found Margaret standing at the sink, both hands gripping the counter, staring out the window at the dark backyard. She didn't hear me come in. She was somewhere else entirely, lost inside whatever grief looks like when you lose the person who was your whole reason for being in a place. My father had been her reason, and now he was gone. She finally sensed me standing there and turned around. Her eyes were red. Her hair was still done up from the funeral, a few strands coming loose around her face. She looked at me for a long moment without saying anything, the way people do when words feel too small for the size of the moment. And then she said it. "Don't leave me alone tonight." Just that. 5 words, barely above a whisper, said without drama or demand. She wasn't begging. She wasn't performing grief. She was just a woman standing in a kitchen, asking a grieving boy not to disappear. I put my coat on the hook by the door. I left my suitcase in the hallway, and I never did walk through that front door that night. Looking back now, I understand that grief is strange in the way it works. It doesn't announce itself politely. It doesn't wait until you're ready. It just arrives, and it empties a room of everything familiar, and it leaves you standing in the middle of what remains, wondering who you are without the person you lost. I was a boy who had just lost his father. Margaret was a woman who had just lost her husband. And somehow, in the same house on the same night, we were both completely alone. We didn't talk much that evening. We sat in the living room, the television on low, neither of us watching it. Margaret made tea she didn't drink. I scrolled through my phone without seeing anything on the screen. But we were in the same room. And that, I would later learn, matters more than most people realize. The days that followed were heavy in a way I struggle to describe even now. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes after a funeral. Not peaceful, not restful, just empty. The casseroles from neighbors stopped arriving. The phone calls thinned out. And slowly, the house in Maplewood settled into a new and uncomfortable silence. Margaret moved through it all with a steadiness that both confused and embarrassed me. Every morning, without fail, she was up before me. By the time I came downstairs, there was always something on the table. Toast, eggs, a glass of juice. She never made a production of it. She never said, "Look what I did for you." She just did it quietly, the way people do when care is genuine rather than performed. I, on the other hand, was a disaster. I slept too late and stayed up too long. I skipped classes at the community college where I had just enrolled. I gave one-word answers to anyone who tried to talk to me, including Margaret. I remember one particular evening when she asked how my day had been, and I looked at her and said, "Fine," in a tone that meant the complete opposite, then walked upstairs and closed my door. She didn't follow me. She didn't knock. She just let me go. That patience of hers, I didn't appreciate it then. I actually resented it. There was something about the way she refused to react, refused to fight back or guilt me or crumble in front of me, that made me feel even more out of control than I already was. It's easier to stay angry when someone gives you something to push against. Margaret never gave me that. She just stayed steady, like a wall that had decided to be a window instead. Weeks passed, then a month, then 2, and slowly, almost without my noticing, Small things began to shift. I started coming downstairs a little earlier. I started sitting at the table instead of taking my food to my room. I didn't say much, but I was present, and Margaret seemed to understand that presence was its own kind of language. One evening in late October, about 6 weeks after the funeral, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. Bills, mostly, and documents I didn't recognize. She looked tired in a way that was different from grief tired. This was practical tired. The kind that comes from suddenly being responsible for everything alone. I sat down across from her without being asked. "What's all that?" I said. She looked up, a little surprised that I had spoken first. "Just sorting through things," she said carefully. "There are a few decisions I need to make about the house." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Do you need help?" She looked at me for what felt like a long time. Then she said, "Yes, I think I do." We sat at that kitchen table until almost midnight, going through papers together. I didn't understand most of it, but I asked questions and she explained, and somewhere between the utility bills and the mortgage documents, something quiet and real passed between us. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that could eventually become trust. Before we turned off the lights that night, Margaret said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "Your father used to say that the bravest thing a person could do was stay somewhere uncomfortable long enough to let it become familiar." She didn't look at me when she said it. She was collecting the papers, stacking them neatly. But I heard it, and I felt it land somewhere deeper than I expected. I went upstairs that night and sat on the edge of my bed, and for the first time since the funeral, I cried. Not politely, not quietly, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere in the chest, the kind that leaves you exhausted and hollowed out but somehow a little lighter. I don't know how long it lasted. When it was over, I lay down and slept better than I had in weeks. I didn't tell Margaret about that, but I think she knew. By the time December arrived, I had stopped thinking about the couch at my friend's place 2 towns over. Maplewood had started to feel less like a place I was trapped in and more like a place I had chosen, even if the choosing had happened quietly, almost by accident. Margaret had started leaving a light on in the hallway for me at night, just a small lamp on the side table, the kind of detail so tiny you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. But I noticed, and noticing it felt like being seen. We were still figuring out the language of our relationship, what to call each other in our own heads, what we were allowed to expect from one another, where the boundaries were and whether they mattered. But something was growing quietly in the background, something that neither of us had words for yet. And then one evening in early December, I came downstairs to find Margaret on the sofa, watching an old movie I half recognized. She glanced over when she heard me come in. "Hungry?" she asked. "A little," I said. She nodded toward the kitchen. "There's pasta on the stove. Made too much." I went and got a bowl. And then, without really thinking about it, I sat down on the other end of the sofa. Not in my room. Not at the kitchen table. On the sofa, next to her, close enough that I could hear the dialogue from the film. She didn't say anything. She just moved the throw blanket slightly so there was more of it on my side. We watched the rest of the movie like that. Not talking, not performing closeness, just existing in the same space without walls between us. And when the credits rolled, Margaret stood up, collected both our bowls without asking, and said good night in that quiet way of hers. I sat there for a while after she left, looking at the blank screen. That was the night I stopped counting the days since the funeral. Not because the grief was gone. It wasn't. But because somewhere between the lamp in the hallway and the extra pasta and the shared corner of a sofa blanket, I had started, without quite meaning to belong somewhere again. And if you're listening to this right now, if something in this story already feels familiar, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're hearing this. It genuinely means everything to know who's on the other side of this. And if this kind of story moves you, consider subscribing to the channel. There are more of them coming, and they are worth staying for. Because what happened next between Margaret and me, well, it was not what either of us planned. And it started with a door I almost didn't knock on. Winter in Maplewood has a particular way of making everything feel closer than it really is. The days get short quickly, The sky turns that flat gray that sits just above the rooftops, and the cold outside makes the inside of a house feel like the only warm thing left in the world. That January, the year after my father died, Margaret and I were living inside that closeness without either of us fully acknowledging it. Things were different now, though neither of us announced it. I had stopped disappearing to my room straight after dinner. Margaret had stopped treating me like something fragile that might break if she said the wrong thing. We had found a kind of rhythm, not perfect, not without its awkward silences, but real. The kind of rhythm that develops between two people who have decided, without saying so out loud, to try. I was enrolled in a full-course load by then, catching up on the semester I had half-wasted in grief. I was up early most mornings, out of the house by 8, back by late afternoon. Margaret worked part-time at an administrative office on the other side of town. A job she had taken when my father got sick, to help with expenses, and had simply kept. We didn't overlap much during the day, but the evenings were ours in a way that had started to feel natural. One evening in late January, I came home to find the house dark and cold. The lamp in the hallway that Margaret always left on was off. No smell of dinner, no sound of the television, just quiet. I stood in the hallway for a moment, coat still on, and felt something I hadn't expected, worry. Not mild inconvenience. Actual worry. The kind that sits in your chest and makes you walk faster. I found her in her bedroom, door only half closed, sitting on the floor with her back against the bed. She wasn't crying. She was just sitting there, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the wall opposite. On the floor beside her was a photograph I recognized. My father and Margaret on their wedding day, small and laughing, her dress slightly windswept, him looking at her like she was the best thing he had ever seen. I pushed the door open a little further. Margaret! She looked up. For a second she looked almost embarrassed, like I had caught her doing something private, which I suppose I had. I'm fine, she said, which was such an obvious untruth that neither of us bothered to pretend it wasn't. I sat down on the floor beside her. Not on the bed, not in the chair across the room, on the floor at her level, close enough that our shoulders were almost touching. I didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. I just sat there. After a while, she said, "Today would have been our anniversary. I hadn't known that. I don't know why I hadn't known it. Maybe because my father had never been the type to make a fuss about dates, or maybe because I had never paid enough attention. Either way, I hadn't known, and sitting there on the floor of her room, I felt the specific shame of that. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it in more ways than one. She exhaled slowly. It gets like this sometimes, she said. It catches you off guard. You think you're fine and then something small, a photograph, a song, the way the light looks at a certain time of day, and suddenly you're right back at the beginning. I knew exactly what she meant. I had had my own versions of that, walking past my father's old jacket hanging by the door, or hearing his kind of music come through someone's car window on the street. Grief, I was learning, does not move in a straight line. It circles back when you least expect it. We stayed on that floor for a long time. I made tea at some point and brought it back. She talked a little about my father. Small stories I hadn't heard moments from before I was old enough to remember. The way he used to overcook pasta and refused to admit it. The road trip they took before they got married. The car breaking down in the middle of nowhere, both of them laughing too hard to be properly annoyed. She talked and I listened, and it felt like being handed something precious and breakable that I needed to be very careful with. At some point, sitting there on the floor with our cooling cups of tea, I realized I had learned more about my father in that one conversation than in years of living with him. That's another thing grief does, I suppose. It unlocks the stories people were holding back, the ones they assumed there would always be more time to tell. By the time we finally got up off the floor, it was past 10. Margaret stood and straightened herself out, and then looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not grateful exactly. Something more specific than that. Like she was seeing me clearly and finding that what she saw was worth something. You didn't have to stay, she said. I know, I said. She nodded once, and something in her shoulders dropped. Not in sadness, but in relief. The relief of not being alone in something heavy. Those months taught me something I have carried since. There is a version of strength that looks like endurance. The kind where you hold everything together on the outside while something inside quietly frays. Margaret had been living that version since the funeral. She had kept the house running, kept the bills organized, kept a lamp on in the hallway and dinner on the stove, all while carrying something enormous entirely by herself. And she had done it without complaint, without asking for recognition, because that was simply who she was. But no one, not even the strongest person you know, can carry something heavy indefinitely without someone else reaching out to take some of the weight. Spring arrived slowly that year, the way it does after a long winter, cautiously in small gestures. A warmer afternoon here, a cluster of crocuses along the front path there. By March, I had settled fully back into my coursework and was doing well enough that my advisor mentioned the possibility of transferring to a 4-year program the following autumn. It was the first time since my father's death that something felt like forward motion rather than just survival. I told Margaret over dinner one evening. I remember watching her face when I said it. The way her expression moved from surprise straight into something that looked remarkably like pride. She set her fork down. "That's wonderful, Lucas," she said. She had started using my name more by then, and I had noticed. It had stopped feeling formal and started feeling personal. "I don't know if I'll go," I said quickly, before I had even thought about why. She looked at me steadily. "Why wouldn't you?" I didn't answer, but we both knew. The answer was sitting right there across the dinner table from me, and we were both carefully not looking at it. The truth was that somewhere between the floor of her bedroom in January and the kitchen table in late February and the quiet sofa evenings in between, Margaret had become something to me that I didn't have a clean word for. Not quite a mother. I had a mother somewhere, though that is a different story for a different day. Not a friend, exactly. Something that sat between all the available categories and refused to be neatly filed. She was the person whose lamp I looked for when I came home late. She was the person whose voice I heard first thing in the morning and whose absence I noticed immediately when she wasn't there. And I was starting to understand, slowly and with some discomfort, that the feeling was not one-sided. She had started saving articles for me, things she'd come across online about transfer applications, scholarship deadlines, universities with strong programs in the subject I was studying. She left them on the counter by the coffee maker, folded neatly, no note attached. Just left there, the way you leave something for someone when you know they'll understand without an explanation. I kept every single one of them. One Saturday morning in late March, I came downstairs to find Margaret standing at the kitchen counter, not cooking, not cleaning, just standing there with a cup of coffee, looking out the back window at the yard. She was wearing a plain gray cardigan, her hair down, and there was something in the way she stood, still, unhurried, quietly present, that struck me in a way I wasn't expecting. She had spent 8 months being invisible by design, and I had let her, because I had been too wrapped up in my own grief to look properly. But standing there in the morning light, I saw her, not as my father's widow or my reluctant housemate, but as a person, a woman with her own interior life, her own losses, her own small daily braveries that nobody was applauding. I poured myself a coffee and stood beside her at the counter. "You okay?" I asked. She smiled without turning her head. "I was just thinking," she said, "about what comes next." She paused. "For both of us." I didn't ask her to say more, but the question stayed in the room between us, warm and open, like a window cracked just enough to let the outside air in. What came next would test both of us in ways neither of us had seen coming. There was a conversation, still a few weeks away, that would say out loud the thing we had both been thinking. And it would start, of all places, at someone else's kitchen table, with a phone call neither of us expected. But that morning in March, standing shoulder to shoulder at the kitchen counter, watching the first real signs of spring move through the backyard, that moment was enough. More than enough. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled, the kind that only exists between two people who have already said the hardest things and survived them together. Neither of us moved for a long time, and outside, slowly and without permission, the world kept turning green. There are moments in a person's life that don't feel important while they're happening. No music swells. Nothing glows at the edges. You are simply standing somewhere ordinary, a driveway, a checkout line, a front porch, and then something is said or seen or understood, and the version of yourself that existed 5 minutes ago quietly closes a door and doesn't come back through it. My moment happened on a Tuesday evening in April, in the parking lot of a grocery store, of all places. Margaret and I had started doing the weekly shop together. It had begun practically. She had the car, I could carry the heavier bags. But it had become something we simply did, the way you fall into a habit so gradually you forget it was ever a choice. We moved through those grocery store aisles with the easy shorthand of two people who know each other's preferences without having to ask. She knew I didn't like the store-brand pasta. I knew she always deliberated too long over cheese and needed someone to just pick one and put it in the basket. That evening, we were loading bags into the back of the car when a woman I vaguely recognized from the neighborhood stopped on her way past. She looked at the two of us, smiled warmly, and said, "You two are always so lovely together. How long have you been married?" There was a half-second of silence. Margaret said, "Oh, we're not. He's my stepson." And the woman apologized cheerfully and moved on. But I caught the expression that crossed Margaret's face in that half-second before she answered. It was not embarrassment. It was not flattery. It was something I could only describe as a flicker, brief and unguarded. There and then gone so quickly I might have imagined it. I didn't imagine it. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. We drove home with the radio on low and the grocery bags shifting in the back, and the whole ride felt like a conversation happening 2 layers below the surface, in a language that neither of us had yet admitted we were speaking. That night, I stayed up long after Margaret had gone to bed. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and thought about things I had been trying not to think about too directly. The lamp in the hallway, the folded articles by the coffee maker, the way she said my name now, the floor of her bedroom in January, and 100 other small moments I had filed away without examining them. And then I thought about who Margaret actually was. She was 38. She had given up the version of her life that came before my father's illness to help take care of him during it, and had then quietly restructured everything again after he was gone. She worked a job that didn't use half of what she was capable of. She wore clothes that seemed designed to make her easy to overlook. She had not been on a single date since the funeral. She laughed at her own jokes when she thought no one was listening, which was the truest kind of funny. She read novels in the bath and left them on the edge of the tub with the pages wavy from the steam. She cried at nature documentaries. She made the best pasta I had ever eaten, better than any restaurant, and she always made too much because she had never quite adjusted to cooking for fewer than 3. She was extraordinary, and she had spent the better part of a year being invisible even to herself. I didn't know what to do with any of that. I was 20 years old and barely capable of understanding my own emotions, let alone someone else's. But I knew, sitting at that table, that I wanted something to be different for her, that I wanted her to be seen, not by me, but in the way a person deserves to be seen when they still have decades of life ahead of them and have forgotten they're allowed to want things. So I started, carefully and without announcing it, to pay a different kind of attention. I began noticing when she looked genuinely happy versus when she was performing okayness for my benefit. I started asking follow-up questions when she mentioned things she used to love, hiking, photography, a ceramics class she had taken before she met my father. I found excuses to make her laugh because I had figured out that laughter was the version of herself she trusted most. And one afternoon in May, sitting on the back porch in the first real warmth of the season, I said something I had been building toward for weeks. "You should sign up for that ceramics class again," I said, out of nowhere, in the middle of an unrelated conversation. She looked at me sideways. "Where did that come from?" "You mentioned it once. Back in February." I shrugged. "You said you used to love it." She was quiet for a moment. "That was a long time ago." "It was 14 months ago," I said. "That's not a long time. That's just bad timing." She looked at me for a beat longer than usual and then laughed, the real kind, not the polite kind. "When did you get so bossy?" she said. "Learned it from watching you," I said. She signed up for the class 2 weeks later. She came home from the first session with clay on her forearms and something lit up in her face that I hadn't seen before. A specific brightness that comes from doing something for the sheer joy of it, with no practical outcome attached. She put a small lopsided bowl she'd made on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, and she smiled every single time she looked at it, even when she thought I wasn't watching. I was always watching, and something was becoming clear to me, slowly and with a weight I was just beginning to feel, that what was growing between Margaret and me had moved past the awkward grief bonding of two people sharing a house after a loss. It had become something I would need to handle carefully and honestly, and without pretending it was simpler than it was. Because in 6 months, I would be leaving for the 4-year program. The application had been submitted. The acceptance letter was already sitting in my email, unopened, because I hadn't yet decided what I wanted to do with it. And Margaret didn't know any of that yet. I would have to tell her. And when I did, everything that had quietly accumulated between us over the past year, every lamp left on, every folded article, every shared sofa evening, every real conversation in the dark, would have to be looked at directly in the light for exactly what it was. That conversation was coming. We were both, I think, already feeling it approach. But that evening on the back porch, with the spring air warm and the yard slowly turning green and the sound of her laughing at something I said, that evening, we let it be simple for just a little while longer. And the lopsided bowl sat on the windowsill and caught the last of the light, and neither of us said anything that needed to be undone. The letter sat in my inbox for 11 days before I opened it. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth is I was afraid, not of rejection because I already knew it was an acceptance, but of what saying yes would mean, and what saying yes out loud to Margaret would cost both of us. So I let it sit there unopened, while life in the Maplewood house continued in its quiet, familiar way. By June, something had shifted in the atmosphere between us that I couldn't fully name. Margaret had started her ceramics class and taken up her camera again. An old film camera she had dug out of a box in the back of the closet, something she hadn't touched in years. She photographed the backyard in the early morning, the light through the kitchen window, the lopsided bowl on the sill. Small things, close things, things that were easy to miss unless you were paying attention. I was always paying attention, and she, I noticed, had started paying a different kind of attention to me. Not the watchful, careful attention of someone monitoring a grieving boy. Something more level, more equal. She asked my opinion on things and waited for the actual answer. She pushed back when she disagreed with me, which was new. She had stopped treating me like someone she needed to protect and started treating me like someone she could talk to. The distinction sounds small. It wasn't. One evening in mid-June, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea and an expression that told me she had something to say and had been working up to it. I sat down. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Someone asked me out today," she said. "No preamble. Just that." I kept my face even. "Yeah. A man from the office. He's kind. Widowed. About my age." She paused. I said I'd think about it. I nodded slowly. "What are you thinking?" She looked at me carefully. "I don't know. I haven't done this it's been a very long time." She exhaled. "I think part of me has just forgotten I'm allowed to." There it was. The thing I had been nudging her toward for months. Now sitting on the kitchen table between us. Fully real. And I found, in that moment, that I had 2 completely different responses happening inside me simultaneously. One that wanted to tell her she absolutely should go, that she deserved it, that it was long overdue. And another, quieter one, that I pushed down quickly and refused to look at directly. "You should go," I said. "At least for coffee. Low stakes." She studied me. "You really think so?" "I really do," I said. And I meant it. Most of me meant it. She went. The date was a Sunday afternoon at a cafe downtown, a place with good light and small tables and the kind of menu that takes itself too seriously. I drove her there and waited at a bookshop 2 streets over, pulling books off shelves and reading the first pages without absorbing a single word. She was back in an hour and 40 minutes. I was parked outside when she came around the corner, and I watched her walk toward the car before she saw me. She had worn the blue dress, the one that had been hanging in her closet with the tags still on it, the one I had told her months earlier she should wear more. She walked like someone who had remembered something important about herself. She got in the car and looked at me. "Well," I said. She thought about it for a moment. "He was kind," she said. "Genuinely kind. Easy to talk to." Another pause. "But it felt like a conversation with someone I'd just met." "That's usually how first dates work," I said. She smiled faintly. I know. I just... She looked out the windshield. I kept thinking about how different it feels to talk to someone who already knows you. She said it simply, without emphasis, not appearing to realize what it landed like. I started the car and didn't say anything. On the drive home, she talked about small details from the date, the too strong coffee, a funny misunderstanding about the menu, something kind he had said about his daughter. She sounded fine. Lighter, even, as if the experience had resolved something she'd been anxious about. But when we pulled into the driveway and she reached for the door handle, she paused. "Lucas," she said. I turned. She looked at me with an expression I didn't know how to categorize, open and careful, and honest in a way that cost her something. "Thank you," she said, "for pushing me to try." "I didn't push," I said. "You did," she said, "in all the right ways." She went inside. I sat in the parked car for a while, hands still on the wheel, the engine off, looking at the lamp she had already turned on in the hallway window. I opened my email. I opened the letter. And I read the acceptance I already knew was there, and I sat with it and I thought about what it would mean to leave. To pack up and move to a campus 4 hours north. To not come home to this house, this kitchen, this particular lamp in this particular window. To have Margaret here, alone, building her life back piece by piece. The ceramics class, the camera, the too strong coffee with a kind man who didn't know her yet, without me down the hall. And I thought about what it would mean to stay. I sat in that car for a long time. When I finally came inside, Margaret was in the kitchen. I stood in the doorway, the same doorway I had stood in almost a year ago, watching her at the sink, her hands wrapped around the counter, before she turned and asked me not to leave. She turned now and saw my expression. "What is it?" she said. I held up my phone, the email still open on the screen. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and read it. Her hand came up to her mouth. When she looked at me, her eyes were bright. "Lucas," she said, and her voice was full of something complicated and completely unguarded. Pride and grief and hope all mixed into one. "I got in," I said, which she already knew. "When would you go?" she asked. "September," I said. "If I go." She lowered her hand. Her voice was steady, but something behind it wasn't. "You're going," she said. "That was never a question." "Margaret." "No," she said firmly and quietly. "Listen to me. You are going. That is not something we need to discuss." She looked at me the way she had that first night, direct and honest and without performance. "I will be fine." "I know you will," I said. "But," she said, because she always heard the parts one didn't say. I didn't answer that. I just looked at her, and she looked at me, and somewhere in the silence between us, everything that had been accumulating for the past year, unspoken and carefully managed and held at the right distance, became impossible to pretend wasn't there. Neither of us named it. We didn't need to. She came forward and put her arms around me, and I held on, and we stayed like that in the kitchen for a long moment, not as stepmother and stepson performing a role, but as 2 people who had chosen each other out of grief and stayed for something else entirely. When she stepped back, her eyes were dry. Mine weren't. "September," she said. "That gives us the whole summer." "The whole summer," I said. She turned back to the kitchen and started moving again. Filling a pot, setting it on the stove, reaching for the pasta with the practiced ease of someone who had made this meal 100 times. And I stayed in the doorway, watching her, the acceptance letter still open on my phone. I closed the email. I would figure out September when September came. Tonight there was dinner. There was the lamp in the hallway. There was this kitchen, warm and lit, with everything that mattered to me standing right in the middle of it. And outside, through the window above the sink, the summer night was just beginning to arrive.